Welcome to Odd's Bodkins Curiosity Shop, where you'll find the unique, the bizarre, and sometimes the haunted. Feel free to look around, peruse the items, and never fear, there's nothing here that bites. Hard anyway. Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Odd's Bodkins Curiosity Shop, your home for horror, fantasy, and science fiction. I am your shopkeeper, Chris Baker, and today we're going to go back to a section of the shop that we've been to not long ago. This is a section of the shop that I always find one of the more eerie sections. This is a section of the shop where we feature a lot of dolls, a lot of puppets and marionettes, and in horror, sometimes fantasy and even science fiction, but mainly in horror, we see these simple child toys in many instances. In other instances, it is a piece of performance art, but we see these items brought to life in a way that fills us with terror. And these particular puppets over here, these are actually figures used in stop-motion animation, and for my money, one of the more eerie forms of animation out there. And there lies the essence of today's episode of Odd's Bodkins Curiosity Shop. So without further ado, let's pull out the kinetoscope and take a look at the new Shudder original, Stop Motion. So Stop Motion is one of those films, another Shudder original. Of course, the movie we talked about on Monday is Shudder original. Shudder, I tell you what, Shudder has been doing a lot of really good stuff this year. I felt like a couple years ago, they were kind of at the top of their game, had some really good movies. Then last year, maybe the year before that, they had some good offerings, but, as a whole, there were a lot of things that were just so-so. But I feel 2024 has really been a comeback year for Shudder as far as some of the quality of their original movies. Stuff like Late Night with the Devil, Arcadian, which we should be seeing on Shudder sometime in the not-too-distant future. In a Violent Nature, which is in theaters right now, and we'll see on Shudder later this year. And of course, this movie that came out in February of this year to a limited number of theaters, and unfortunately, I was not able to see it, and none of the movie theaters around where I was living that I saw were playing this movie, but it finally dropped on Shudder, and that movie is Stop Motion. It's a movie that as soon as I heard the name, I knew what it was going to be about, stop motion animation, and that, like I said, even those like holiday specials from back in the 60s, the Rankin Bass, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and stuff like that, that stop motion animation, even though it's used in a lot of kid shows, used in a lot of childlike whimsy and fantasy, it also has an eeriness and a creepiness about it. So right there, I knew they could do some really cool stuff with it as far as a horror movie goes. And when I saw the trailer, I was like, oh, this could be pretty good. This could be pretty creepy and hopefully could be really scary. Now that I've watched it, I don't know if it lived up to my expectations. Maybe my expectations were a little too high. I didn't love the movie, but I thought the movie was really good from an experimentation standpoint. I mean, this movie is definitely in the vein of things like In a Violent Nature or things like Late Night with the Devil. It is a bit of experimentation on the part of the filmmaker that really lends itself to this being, well, it may not be a perfect movie. It's so interesting and so different when you mix the mediums that are being used here with live action acting and then the stop motion animation. It adds an eeriness and a creepiness to it. You can't manufacture that sort of eerie tension in any other way than adding that stop motion animation. And I, for one, really like this movie. Like I said, not a great movie, not my favorite movie of the year, but a movie that I really enjoyed watching, even though it did have its faults. It made up for it in a lot of other areas that we're going to get into once we get into the spoiler section. So if you haven't watched Stop Motion, go check it out. It's on Shudder right now. I believe it's also been on video on demand for a while, but go check it out and come back and listen to my thoughts on Stop Motion. If you have watched it or you don't care about spoilers one way or the other, then we're going to head on into some spoiler territory. So first thing we see in stop motion was a real telling scene for this movie. You had the main character, Ella, played by Aisling Franciosi. And if you're not familiar with her, I mean, you've probably seen her in a lot of things. She was in that movie, The Nightingale. She did some voice work in the last season of The Legend of Vox Machina. She's also plays Anna in The Last Voyage of the Demeter, which I really enjoyed her in that. She's going to be in the new remake of that foreign film, Speak No Evil, which is a movie that when I first watched it, I liked it, but I didn't like it. I didn't feel like it was a horror movie. But then as I rewatched it and I've thought about it, it's a different kind of horror. It's not your typical horror movie. And they're doing an American remake of this movie, Speak No Evil, coming out probably sometime this year. So I'm really excited to see her in that. But Aisling Franciosi, she plays Ella, and the first scene that we get with Ella, it's just her, and it's a very artistic depiction of her where it jump cuts between shots of her, one looking normal, one looking more sinister, and it jumps back and forth between these two images of her with various lighting, and it's a very artistic way to start this movie. It's a very unnerving way to start this movie because you're really getting the sense, or at least I did, that this is our main character and there's something off about this character, and this character is an unreliable narrator for this movie because we're going to be watching this movie through her perspective. So right off the bat, I knew this movie was going to be showing us things that weren't quite what they seem. And if you get that, it's going to make a lot of things make more sense as the movie goes on. And first off, I have to say that anybody who watched this movie, you really have to watch this understanding what you're going to watch, because if you're expecting an action-y horror film with big bombastic, slasher film type characters, everybody's over the top acting, if you're expecting like some sort of monster chase scene, this is not the movie. This is a very quiet movie. This is a very subdued movie. This is a very sad movie. This is a movie that is more about the message than it is about the action, but it's certainly not style over substance. There is substance to this movie, and there is a theme to this movie, and there's an artistic flair to this movie. I think it does an interesting balancing act of all these things, but this is definitely not an action-y horror film. So if you're going into it looking for that, you're going to be sorely disappointed. And I think many of the people that are disappointed, they were expecting more monsters and more chase scenes and more over-the-top horror than this, which is very nuanced and very subtle and very cerebral. This is a very cerebral and psychological horror. Not that it backs off of the gore. There is gore to that. There is scary moments. There are a couple jump scares in this, but you have to keep in mind those things when you're watching that, and you find out right away that Ella is not a reliable narrator for this story from that very first scene. And we get introduced to her and her mother, and it's a really interesting dynamic between these two characters that I think a lot of people can relate to. You have a mother who is a famous stop motion filmmaker, and her daughter is kind of living in her shadow. The mother, Suzanne, played by Stella Gonet, not an actress I'm familiar with, but she does a really good job with this character. What little she's in it, she's not in it a ton. Mainly in the beginning and then some like other little scenes, but she really does a lot with this character. And she plays this overbearing mother who is a famous stop motion animation filmmaker, but she is having a health issue. She has arthritis, so now Ella has to be her hands for her. And it really plays into that notion of a child growing up under a famous parent and almost being stifled. You get the notion right away that Ella's creativity has been stifled under the perfectionist nature of her mother. And when she decides that she's going to ask her mother, hey, can I come up with some ideas? And the mother, kind of is very standoffish at first. And then the next day she's like, okay, what ideas do you have? And then Ella, it's kind of hard to tell whether she has ideas, but she's just afraid to bring them to the table, or she doesn't really have any ideas because her mother has done all the thinking for her, especially in these years when she is being the hands for her mother who can't manipulate these stop motion animation figures. Now we find out later that Ella, in fact, doesn't have any ideas. But I thought the dynamic between these two characters, this overbearing mother that is casting a shadow too big for the child to get out from under, even though the child wants to. The child is very talented. She's good at what she does in stop motion. And even though her perfectionist mother makes her feel like she's not good enough, but there's a really interesting dynamic between these two characters and these two actresses. Aisling Franciosi plays Ella fantastically. I really enjoy her as an actress. Some of the things I've seen her in up until now, and I look forward to seeing more from her in the future as an actress, especially off of this performance, because it is very much a troubled performance. She is a troubled character, and as you find out as this movie goes on, there are two sides to her. We get kind of a sneak peek of that in that first shot of her where it flip-flops back and forth between a very normal look of her and a very sinister look. And we meet the young child that Ella comes across, played by Carolyn Springall, another young actress who does a really good job. I really enjoyed her performance in this. And right away, you realize, or at least I did, and you find out later, and we are in the spoiler territory, so this shouldn't come as a shock to you, that this little girl is a young version of Ella. It's almost like the creative child inside, because children are all about creativity, unless that creativity is snuffed out by overbearing parents. But I, as a child, was a very creative kid, always, playing make-believe and making things up and making little stories with my action figures and going out in the woods and battling dragons and monsters of all sorts with my stick sword. And so kids are all about imagination, and this little girl, this younger version of Ella, kind of represents that bit of creativity that is inside of her, that childlike creativity, that artistic flair within her that at times is almost, if not more manipulative than Ella's mother. And I found it funny how Ella's mother, Suzanne, always calls Ella puppet. And you see right away that she is kind of a puppet on her mother's string. She does whatever her mother tells her to do when it comes to creating stop motion animation. Her mother is the creator. She is just the hands moving things around. And there's an interesting scene after Ella's mother has a stroke and she's in the hospital, and the scene is actually probably something that's more going on in Ella's head, but they're having a talk about this creative side of Ella that's manifested as itself, and talking about when creations come to life, and the mother saying how she learned to control it, and she knows that Ella can't control it, and once the puppet has played its part, it's going to be put back in the box. And that's a little foreshadowing to what's going to happen to Ella. And it all really, once you see it happening, you're not sure. I mean, you think you know what's going on, but then it all really makes sense when it all plays out in the very end. So a really interesting dynamic between these two characters, a really interesting dynamic within their relationship between the two characters, Ella and her mother, and also Ella and the little girl. Now, beyond that, I mean, that was all interesting. That kept me engaged for the most part throughout this movie. This psychological game between Ella, her mother, Ella, the little girl, and everything that's going on. But really, the thing that was most captivating about this is the stop motion animation. The stop motion animation was really cool. It was interesting seeing almost kind of a look behind the curtain when you're seeing Ella and her mother creating her mother's stop motion animation movie. Then when Ella moves on to do what the little girl is suggesting, and really the little girl, the manifestation of her own creative subconscious. When you're seeing that, that's all very interesting to see that. But then when these things come to life, and a lot of it is in the imagination of Ella. I don't think these things are actually coming to life, but in her mind they are. And some of those scenes were some of the creepiest scenes, when that little doll comes into her room and climbs up on her bed, and it's almost like she's frozen, like she has night terrors. That was creepy as fuck. And then when she kind of cuts her open, that was wicked. Some of the scenes with the Ashman were creepy and scary, whether it is the puppets playing out, the stop motion animation figures playing out the movie that Ella and the little girl are creating, or when these creatures come to life and are more life-size. I mean, some of that stuff was really cool creature design and really creepy sort of surreal horror, as far as these things coming to life. That one scene where the Ashman comes out of the ground of the set that she's built for her movie, and he's life size, and like her legs buckle and like buckle. There's some body horror there. There's a lot of body horror in this on many levels, between her ripping that cut open, that stitched cut, and pulling pieces out, her legs breaking and buckling. There was a lot of really good body horror in this as well. But that scene where her legs buckle and she essentially turns into this mortician's wax doll that runs into this hole under the wall. It was so surreal and so psychological and bizarre. It was fascinating and horrifying, and what the fuck am I watching? It had that feel to it that was very engaging, I thought. Now, I've heard some people say that this is one of the goriest films they've ever seen. I disagree with that. It's gory, and it's got some really good gore scenes, but it's not that gory. The gore is intermittent, and when it does happen, it's pretty gory. It's pretty good. Like I said, it's got some really good body horror, but I would not say that this is the goriest film I've ever seen. Not by a long shot. That's not a slight against this movie. It's just, it's got gore. It doesn't have tons of gore, and the gore that you have is effective and good. But yeah, I've seen a lot gorier films. So if you're going in looking for that, you're going to be disappointed. So, manage your expectations on it. But ultimately, where this movie, I think, shines most are the things it's trying to say. And it had a lot of really interesting things to say. Like I said, there's a lot that have to deal with children and overbearing parents, or parents that cast a shadow that they can't get out from under, and parents that stifle creativity. There's a lot to say about that. But I think even bigger, I think there is a theme and a message about losing oneself to your own art. And you see that with the Ella character, how she's a bit of a snob. When her boyfriend talks about, hey, you don't have to do this movie because she's, obviously having a mental break because of this movie. Here, you don't have to do this movie. You can do videos for my band. And she kind of chuckles, and she's like, you're not a musician. You put on a suit and you go do your real job every day. Kind of putting him down for not being a real artist, because he goes and has a day job, and he got really upset about that and offended, and rightfully so. When her boyfriend Tom's sister offers her a job to work at the stop motion film studio that she works for. Apparently stop motion is a lot bigger thing in this universe than in ours. I wish stop motion was a bigger thing these days, like it was in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, but unfortunately it's not. And I hope that changes. But in this world, there is a studio that they're doing lots of stop motion projects, but she kind of poo-poos it as almost being like selling out. Like, oh, I'm not going to work in that sort of environment where it's, everything's being mass produced, and she's a real artiste. And so you have that sense of her losing herself. She's pushing people away because of her art. But then you have her getting so involved in the art that she's creating that she starts to lose her mind. And I thought there was a lot of really interesting things. And then, that scene at the end when you get to the climax where the big version of the Ashman starts to eat her face. It's like her being devoured by her own art. And then that very final scene where she takes refuge in what seems to be this lifelike room that is like the set of her stop motion animation film, and the little girl's there, and she's just watched the film that she's created, and she says she loves it. And Ella opens up this gold-lined box and gets into the box. And it very much calls back to the words that her mother said in that kind of fever dream that she had about once the puppeteer is done with the puppet is put away. And that's where you see that the creative, artistic side in her, the manipulative, artistic side in her has got what it's wanted. And now Ella is no longer needed, and she is put in a box. And now this more sinister, artistic side of her is taking control. To what end that means, I don't know. I mean, I like how this is a bit of an open ending. It's open-ended. It's a bit surreal. It's metaphoric. It leaves you to think about what you just witnessed and what this means for Ella and what this means to you and how you relate to it if you're an artistic person, or not even if you're an artistic person. Some people don't even necessarily get lost to their own art. They get lost to their job, or they get lost to some other aspect of their life, lost to drinking, lost to drugs. Some people get lost to a hobby, or they get lost to a particular person. They lose themselves because they're so focused on this one thing. And I think there's a lot that anybody could kind of relate to. Even though you're not an artist per se, I think a lot of people could relate to some of the themes and some of the things. And like I said, that I think the main theme of this movie, at least for me, was losing oneself to your art. Or whatever. Losing yourself to fill in the blank, whatever pertains to you, whatever fits your life. So ultimately, a really good movie. I will say that this movie feels a little long at points. It is, I would even say it's a slow burn. It's a very even-keeled movie. It's a very steady movie. It's an hour and 33 minutes. It feels every bit of that, if not a little longer, just because of that steady feel to it. It makes it feel longer than it actually is. But in that steady, even keel feel to the movie, there is a sense of dread throughout this movie. There is an unnerving feeling throughout this movie. There is a heightened bit of tension that you steadily get throughout this movie. It peaks a little at times when you get some scary moments, but throughout the movie, you're always on edge. You're always feeling like something's not right. And to me, that was worth it being a little slower. It was worth it feeling a little longer to have a movie where I just felt like I was tensed up the whole time I was watching it. So ultimately, I am a fan of this movie. I'm really glad I finally got to watch it. Like I said, not my favorite movie of the year, but I thought it was really good. And not a movie without faults, but definitely a movie that I enjoyed watching. And it's the kind of movie that I'll probably end up watching again. Not so much because, I enjoyed it so much, I want to watch it again. Not that I didn't enjoy it, but I want to watch it again because it was there's a lot to wrap your mind around. And I quite enjoyed that. And it had really good acting. I really enjoyed Aisling Franciosi. I thought she did a fantastic job. The other supporting cast did a really good job, but she did a really good job carrying this movie, carrying the psychology of this movie, the mental break of this movie. And that's really what this is one big, long mental breakdown. She's broken from the beginning, but she's shattered by the end of it. And she did a fantastic job playing this, and really look forward to seeing more from her. But from an effects standpoint, the stop motion animation effects were just brilliant. The practical gory effects that they did in this were top notch. And like I said, it's not the goriest film ever, but the gore that they do is really good. The body horror that they do is really good. And it's an interesting, different take on horror. When you're mixing live action and stop motion animation, it's something different. It's not your typical Scream meta. We're going to pretend like everybody knows they're in a horror film. That shit's a dime a dozen. Some sort of demon possession exorcism movie that feels like it is a carbon copy of every other demon possession exorcism movie. It's not that. If you don't like seeing the same shit all the time, don't shit on movies and filmmakers that try to do something different. And Robert Morgan, this is his feature-length directorial debut, and I thought did a really good job. The imagery, the color palette, the use of color in this was brilliant from a cinematography standpoint, from Leo Hinston. It was a beautiful movie to watch from an artistic standpoint. And he, along with Robin King, who wrote the screenplay, a wonderful job. And I really look forward to more from all of these filmmakers and from this cast as well. So I want to thank everybody for listening to my thoughts on Stop Motion, an excellent movie that you can check out on Shudder right now. I want to thank everyone for listening, and don't forget to check out Bodkins Curiosity Shop on our Facebook and Instagram pages. We're always posting about horror, fantasy, and science fiction, as well as the latest episodes. You can always follow, subscribe to us, no matter where you listen to this podcast. That way you can stay on top with all the latest episodes. Please leave a review. 5 stars would be awesome, but whatever review you leave, we appreciate that. And as always, please share this podcast with anyone that you know that loves horror, fantasy, and science fiction. So until next time. Thank you for visiting Bodkins Curiosity Shop. We hope that you found something to your liking and visit the shop again soon. But even though you may come back, you never really get to leave Bodkins Curiosity Shop.